get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Doug Fuller, who's on our committee that put this together. Doug is going to give us kind of a historical context to get us started. What are the PFRA pastures, and where did they come from, and what is the system now, and how has it evolved and developed over time? Are you ready, Doug? Sure. Anybody have any questions before we get started? Because there might be some thoughts that you have right in your mind right now. Any questions or thoughts?
I'm not sure where fire exits are. I suspect just up that door you came in.
Wow, you think everything, Brody. That's impressive. Okay. All right, fire exit. Yeah, right there. We can just run right out. Okay. Thank you.
So you've heard me speak, Brody. Good morning. Thank you for coming. I work as policy manager for the Agricultural Producers Association, and I was pleased to be part of the organizing group for this event and working with them. We're going to have to live with the fact that this image is leaning to the right, and that's going to be particularly difficult for me. As I've been involved in this pastures issue, I couldn't help long ago think about that quite famous remark by the philosopher George Santayana. Kind of sticks in my mind. I'll come back to it at the end. The earliest exploration here really didn't have anything to do with agriculture. It was around the fur trade, and I should have gone back to Harold Innis, who's famous for his staples theory. You know, first we had fish, and then we had furs, and then we had timber, and then we had wheat, and so on. That's almost a bit of one of the threads that goes through the presentation. And the southern areas of the prairies were largely ignored because that was the focus of the day. And those who did come out and explore and work in the fur trade described them as a remote desert in an uninhabitable subarctic wilderness. My bibliography comes at the end. You'll see the references here. Balkwell is, I forget his first name, the preeminent scholar on the pastures. He wrote his thesis here in 2006, I think it was, at the U of S. The southern prairies were considered unable to support agriculture by those early observers, and the cultivation of the day was limited to root crops around the outposts. Eventually, the focus on the prairies changed to more of an agricultural one, and some surveys that we know about, including the one done by Palliser, actually went deliberately into the southern areas to assess the agricultural potential, and this really did become a precursor to the national policy around Western settlement that occurred later. And these surveyors were aware of the reports coming out of the U.S. of a vast desert in the areas, some of the areas to the west of the Mississippi, and so they had that in mind when they came. And they did describe the area out here as largely a dry, sterile plain bounded to the north and east by a well-wooded, fertile arc of rich soil. And these kind of perceptions did inform the settlement patterns, and in fact the homesteading was not allowed in the Palliser Triangle for a long time because of this perception. And this did, however, on the other hand, provide a break in perception from the previous northern accounts related to the fur trade, so there's beginning to be a bit of an agricultural focus to the survey work. There's been many writers on the national policy, you know, around Confederation going forward, and then the national policies that emerged through and after the Depression that occurred in the 1870s. I'm going to make some statements here which I think are reflective of objectives of national policy through that period of time. Perhaps the most important one being that the objective was to develop an economic integration on an east-west axis to create markets for industries in central Canada. The goal was to produce a physical link to the west coast to BC and occupy the territory in order to establish and confirm our sovereignty over it post-Confederation, even though the United States had officially declared recognition of our country. And in so doing, thinking of things like the Fenian raids and so on, plus the hue and cry around 5440 and fight and so on, to forestall American expansion northward. There also was an emerging awareness of a vast mineral wealth in the interior of BC, and there was movement from the U.S. up into that area, and so the goal also was to control that nationally. And they wanted to pay for that railway. And there was some interest ultimately, eventually, in developing an agricultural frontier for export. Ontario had been a wheat economy for maybe about a decade until their soils became depleted, say in the 1850s into the 1860s. By 1870, had declined and was not a factor. In terms of Western settlement, the Prairies settlement was instrumental to all of these objectives, a central feature of it. And as I said, the Ontario wheat boom had ended by 1871. And integrating agricultural production was more and more seen as a key element to the success of the entire scheme around the national policy. And thus, assessing the agricultural potential of the prairies became a priority. So we had more surveys. And in the 1870s, surveys around the flora and fauna out here provided favorable reports and ultimately moved what was perceived to be arable land into the fringes of the Palliser Triangle. And these survey findings were favorable ones were reflected in the reports of the Department of the Interior of the day. A geologist with the International Boundary Commission, George Dawson, during this time declared much of the region well suited for pastoral occupation and stock farming. So the interest in the agricultural potential was revolving around its grazing and livestock production potential. And that really was the focus. Still more surveys. As interest in settlement grew, there were more efforts to establish the credibility of crop production in the ag frontier, and a beginning emphasis more on the productive capacity of the land beyond grazing and livestock production. And we find in the literature that those who were doing the surveys started to reflect what seemed to be the political need of the day. For example, McCoon, who was a botanist for those early surveys I referred to earlier, was sent out 3 times later in that decade, and his reports back exempted only a small area around the Cypress Hills that he declared there is no such thing as a fertile belt at all, and it is all equally good land. So a bit of a change in the perception of the productive capacity here. There were some problems with the survey. He emphasized only the ideal aspects. He based it on vegetative cover and not soil type. And he came during an abnormally wet year, or wet period. So produced pretty glowing reports. And so the momentum was growing to identify the capacity for crop production out here. While all of this is going on, the focus on the ground is still on grazing. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 had opened up the land for homesteading as early as that, but that was not proceeding quickly at all. The early strategy for control of the West revolved around private sector cattle ranching. And in 1881, that act was amended to allow for 21-year leases at a penny per acre on areas of land up to 100,000 acres. So that was a strategy post-Confederation. And open range ranching prevailed. Ultimately, the what's so-called Texas system, McLaughlin documents this very well in his work. The regulations of the day favored large-scale ranches over small stock growers, and I note the footnote in Balco's work. He notes the fact that the large-scale producers were politically connected. And the small scale producers were not as competitive because of the the high costs related to the system. Those who took up those leases early in the game were largely Canadian and British interests, and they became absentee landlords, many of them, much to the chagrin of local residents and those who wanted to establish smaller scale operations and communities here. American interest did occur, though, in the mid-1880s as cattle prices were rising, and in that one year, American cattle interests took up 20% of the available land, basically on the low carrying capacity lands in the very southwest corner of the province. And there was another boom about a decade later, a boom of interest in the area from American cattle interests. Eventually, however, this open range ranching did collapse. McLaughlin's work is excellent on this. Part of it due to the fact there were unsuitable breeds from the south not acclimatized to our winters. There were price fluctuations through those decades that undermined the competitive position of cattle production here. There was growing competition eventually for the land from homesteaders, but perhaps the ecological factors involved here, the climate was the predominant factor. And in particular, there were a couple of occurrences of very severe winters, one in 1886-87 where 60 to 90% of the livestock were lost from Alberta, Saskatchewan, going well south into the United States. And then again, a famous winter in 1906-07 when 50% of the livestock was lost here in the prairies. But those losses were also large among the hardy breeds, not just the southern ones, even among the British and European breeds that were here. And so McLaughlin shows that Texas system of grazing might have been unsustainable in any climate due to its tendency to overgraze, but open ranching really generally was incompatible with the climate. And what did emerge was an understanding that smaller scale production with the ability to intervene to control weather might be better suited to the region. We're talking here about ability to fence the cattle in, to have corrals, to fence them out of the hay storage areas you have, to be able to find places to produce hay during the summer, to be able to feed them through a tough winter, and so on. Back to the growing interest in crop production. Western settlement had been growing slowly in importance, but that homesteading activity had been largely limited to areas outside the Palliser Triangle. But in the late 1890s, a spate of good weather for crop production and high grain prices advanced the interest in grain production. Another survey, the Deputy Minister of Interior came out in 1901. He described pasture areas and areas with grain potential, but it's interesting that his recommendation was that they delay any change in the approach to homesteading until that land classification could be undertaken. So there was still an awareness and understanding of the need to preserve some areas as pasture land. But just a few years later, as the momentum behind homesteading grew, and it was becoming a roaring success in other parts of the prairies in Saskatchewan, the Minister of the Interior overrode that recommendation and provided new criteria for grazing leases that specifically said that you will not consider climatic conditions as a condition for leasing. and declared that only land that is too, and you can read it there, too gravelly, sandy, too rough, that would be classified as fit for that purpose and as being suitable to be covered by grazing leases. And what this decision did was eliminated very few acres in the Palliser Triangle. Only those which were extremely unsuitable to crop production would not be open to settlement. And so in 1908, the penny grazing leases were rescinded, and homesteading was opened up to that entire area between Moose Jaw and Calgary and the U.S. border in Battleford. Preemptions were allowed, 320 acres or more rather than 160 in other areas, presumably because you needed more land there to make a profit and make your farm viable. So there was a distinct incentive to people because they could get at least twice as much land. And the whole purpose was to promote settlement and pay for the Hudson Bay Railway of the day. What occurred during that period is pretty dramatic. Cropland in southwest Saskatchewan grew from 500,000 acres to 4.5 million acres, 9 times over that decade. And the population swelled as well from 46,000 to 178,000. And so I'm going to assert this, that this decision in 1908 was a deliberate public policy decision to privatize the land. And it's summarized, I'm just going to let you read that. That's from the Rowell-Sirwa report. It summarizes it well, the decision. And I think the last sentence speaks volumes. Actually, I probably didn't need the first 15 slides. I could have just shown this one. We're okay? So that's where we end up with the opening up of the land to cultivation. There were early problems with the outcomes of that decision. There were attempts to diversify production into livestock, but that was really stifled by the high grain prices that were occurring at the time. But in 1918 through 1920, there was a drought that hit the southwest part of this province and southeast Alberta. And soil drifting began then, and the ag economy began to collapse, and considerable amounts of relief were being, dollars were being expended on seed and fodder and relief to the farmers in the area. And as a result of this, the Saskatchewan government organized a conference in Swift Current in 1920. What do we do about it? To examine the issue around the drifting soils. There wasn't enough grazing land around anymore. And how do we educate farmers about practices to deal with the ecological problems that were occurring from cultivation of this land, this marginal land? And the subsequent Royal Commission in 1921 made a number of recommendations, including these. There was a regional substation set up in Swift Current, our research point there. They recommended comprehensive soil surveys. They recommend more scientific land use planning, which certainly is a harbinger of the PFRA to come some years later. And they recommend development of public grazing tracts. This in 1921. And out of that emerged some new techniques around cultivation, strip farming, less cultivation for fallowing, cooperative grazing tracts. But this whole trend was short-lived because the rains came back and the prices went up and wheat production became profitable on marginal land again. And so much of the area went back into wheat production and ignored the drought and the erosion. However, in parts, the drought continued. The area west of Swift Current, or west of Swift Current and in southeast Alberta, continued through to 1926. And the outcomes of this, in my reading, really did become lessons not learned long before the Depression. Here's some of the outcomes of that drought in that more localized area. From 1921 to 26, the census shows in Alberta 10,000 abandoned farms, half of them near Medicine Hat, and likewise the population in that area dropping dramatically. In Saskatchewan, not as severe, but substantial, 4,900 abandoned farms, 900 of them north of the Swift Current area bordering the Alberta. But the disaster was yet to come, as we know, with the Depression, the drought, and production problems for grain, and the economic depression that occurred in most of the 30s. And I also again make an assertion that the result here was the greatest ecological disaster in the history of Canada. Many witnessed the collapse of the ag economy in Saskatchewan, massive abandonment of farms, public intervention on a massive scale, and massive relocation of people out of that Palliser Triangle area. And just to get a sense of the scope of that ecological disaster, thinking of how the dust storms in our province would have been similar to those elsewhere, James Gray points out that in the U.S. in 1934, there was a bad storm and a cloud of dust rose 10,000 feet over the Atlantic, and they started to calculate how much dust was required, and when they reached 300 million tons, they stopped calculating. And he also says that by 37, the PFRA had estimated that the disaster here had engulfed 60 million acres. That is a lot of acres. That's maybe half of all of the acres, I'm roughly speaking, in Western Canada. What about the socioeconomic impact? Well, the relief that was extended across Canada, with Canada at an index of 100, we were 3.67 times that. Our index here during that period was 367. As a percent of total income in the province of Saskatchewan in that period, relief was 13.3%, 4 times higher than the national average. As a percent of, down lower on the table, a percent of municipal and provincial revenues in Saskatchewan was 60.5% versus 20% in the rest of Canada. Per capita relief here was $196 versus 76 in the rest of Canada. So ultimately, out of this much more serious disaster, the PFRA was created. The act creating the agency was passed in '85 and amended in '37 to undertake resettlement and also to create the pasture system. Its mission is to manage a productive, biodiverse rangeland and to promote environmentally responsible land use and practices. And its mandate includes preference for smaller operators who are new entrants or expanding existing producers, i.e. cow-calf producers. In terms of the impact of the pasture system, I want to repeat, objective number 1 is preserving environmentally sensitive land. It's not about cattle. But cattle production does provide a direct link to the marketplace that it provides a revenue stream to sustain the system. And I've come to the conclusion that the PFRA pastures may be the first, the best, and arguably the largest scale environmental goods and services project ever in Canada, unless we consider maybe the national parks to be greater on any of those measures. And, by the way, it helps Canada meet its international commitments on carbon sequestration. In terms of economic and social benefits, there are many. They've been very instrumental in sustaining mixed farms in this province. And in turn, those mixed farms have helped build the cattle herd and maintain livestock production in this province. Rural communities are sustained both by the mixed farms and the PFRA employees. I had an occasion about 6 weeks ago to tour southwest Saskatchewan and meet with pasture patrons and RM councils with my colleagues, and we learned firsthand from them how important those pastures are in the southwest, the area around Console. Nearly a quarter of the school children are from PFRA employee families. And when we spoke to some of them, they saw this divestiture of the pastures as, and I'm quoting, it's another way to empty our houses. The PFRA also is the best system for recruitment and training of pasture managers and operators. We learned this firsthand from talking to the managers there. Who else would take in someone who's 16 years old and allow them to develop a career and learn how to become a manager of those pasture lands? It's a wonderful system for HR, recruitment and management. In terms of public and community benefits, I'm going from, I won't attempt a pronunciation, he's also known as Dr. Cool at the U of S. And you'll find his work in my bibliography, but he's got a piece in the Sask Encyclopedia on the federal pastures. And if you note, he's worked out what the private social and fiscal benefits of the federal pasture system are. And I've done some calculations of the percentages down there. He's indicating based on his, I would indicate based on his numbers that half of the benefit of the pastures goes to the patrons and 44% goes to the public. Continuing on, he makes the point very clearly that major public good is derived from these pastures. And he concludes his piece in the encyclopedia by saying that they should not be sacrificed for reducing government expenditures. That was 10 years ago. Also, this is out of the business plan, the PFRA business plan itself. I was struck by the fact that they had a business plan that was available, and it's still available, from 2006 going right through 2011-12. And they had a plan, and they were going to carry on. And they had a vision, and they knew how to get there. As part of that business plan, I pulled out this chart where they've calculated from their own insights into their operations that the benefits from the pasture system, 64% of them would go to the public on that first bar, at 37.3 million. But the costs, just below that, are 5.9, which is only 25% of the cost of the system. So that's a pretty good return on investment. And I think one of the other things, there's much debate about do the pastures make money or do they lose money, are they subsidized or whatever, but more and more I hear that some of them make money, and generally speaking the PFRA system pays for its management and operating costs. And there's clear evidence from Dr. Kuhl and from the business plan itself that the subsidization here is, if there is any, is well worth it. What else have I got? There's also clearly the value of the shared land use for recreational use. Found a strong sense in that tour of southwest Saskatchewan that there's a great deal of interest from pasture managers and patrons in joint use and having that land used for other things such as hunting. Also for protection of flora and the fauna and the habitat, and protection of endangered species. So the bottom line, from my point of view, is that the system is an environmentally sound land use policy created in response to the greatest ecological disaster in the history of Canada that, in turn, was an outcome of a deliberate public policy to privatize the land. And a century later, we have a deliberate public policy to privatize the same land, with a range of negative environmental outcomes hanging in the balance. Where